Another couple of examples are the ungulates, things like deer and bighorn sheep. I'm not going to touch too much on bighorn sheep because last week got that problem. So ungulates I remember in 1994 we had some big fires on the winter range up the Antioch drainage, so a little bit north of Leavenworth. And it certainly created, on the short term, a reduction in the food resources. But what really affects how severe that's going to impact deer, especially deer, is a combination of that with what happens the next couple of winters. So their food resources have been declined. This year we have had a pretty easy winter so far. As I was driving up, I was watching deer that were foraging on the green grass. It's already popped. It looked like it was late April or May out there instead of February. But what happened in 1994 was we had a fire, and 2 years later, 1996, the winter of 96-97 was one of the worst ever. It was really, really brutal winter. And it took a long time for that herd to recover from that combination of those two things. But in the long term, as a few years go by, as the grasses and the shrubs and the forbs respond to that fire, we're probably going to see an uptake in the available food resources on the winter range. And we use birds as our indicator. I really like using birds. The caption says, "How birds see the world." So this is how birds see forest restoration. And I like using birds because they're easy to sample, they're easy to study. Although I can't do it because my hearing isn't good enough anymore, but I hire young people with really good ears, and they go out and they identify in these forest stands that we study. They identify birds by listening to them. And the other thing is, with birds, you can look at like 40 or 50 species in the study. And you can look at these birds that use a whole variety of habitats, from those that nest on the ground, that nest in the tree, that nest in the cavity. So it gives you a pretty big idea of how many other wildlife species might respond to these kinds of treatment. Nation together about where should we do the priority for restoration for both of those so that it's integrated. It's just there. As I think you've probably seen from my talk, fire has such an important role in the role it plays on wildlife habitat here on the side. So the restoration strategy really what we did is here, we worked with some folks from the research lab. We created a process that we go through to evaluate a landscape and develop kind of stand level or very specific ideas of where we would want to do those kind of treatments, those prescribed fire and thinning treatments. And I want to talk just a little bit about a couple of the components of the strategy, the one around disturbances and wildlife habitat. But we also evaluate the pattern of the vegetation, and we evaluate things around the aquatics as well. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we take some of that information we learned and write it into the stand level kind of ideas for habitat. So the landscape, or the restoration strategy, is the first step there to develop an idea of your landscape. Look at a landscape. And by a landscape, think about a watershed. So think about the Twist River drainage. That's a good place to just kind of get in your mind. And what we do is we look at what's the condition of different parts of the ecosystem? What's the condition of the wildlife habitat? What's the condition of the disturbances in that watershed? And from that, we look at how has it changed from its historical condition. And by looking at the difference between current and historical conditions for things like habitat and things like fire, we can get an idea where we should do our restoration work. So reference conditions. This is something I want to just give you a little bit of background on what that means. Reference condition is simply an objective way of measuring what condition the watershed is in. So it's a way in which we evaluate whether a watershed has changed from its historical condition. So what we do is we look at how we actually make a map of the historical watershed. And we know, for example, in the Douglas fir, what proportion of that landscape was young forest, what proportion was mid-forest, what was old forest. We know that from historical records that we've reconstructed for these landscapes. And then we take that and we say, okay, what does the current landscape look like? How much and how has it changed over time? So it gives us a way of evaluating what parts of this landscape are missing, or what parts do we have too much of. It gives us the idea of where we should focus our work. So that reference condition is really, really key. It gives us a way of evaluating change over time. And we look at how fire is likely to move across the landscape, and we look at how fire behavior is likely to be affected by the type of forest that we have on the landscape. So how much of that landscape was historically low severity fire and is currently in a condition that would burn at high severity? Or how much of that landscape is in a low severity and should be a low severity? That kind of comparison. And what we find over and over again when we look at this is we find a whole bunch of mixed and high severity in places where it was historically low. That's kind of the pattern that we see over and over again. So what do we do about that? It gives us a way of identifying where that happens. For wildlife habitat, we look at, again, some of the species I talked about. And again, we look at how has their habitat changed. So how much white-headed woodpecker habitat was on that landscape historically? And how well connected was it? Was it fragmented naturally, or was it well connected naturally? And it gives us a sense to look at where are the places that we could reconnect habitat, or where are the habitats that are in low abundance compared to their historical condition, where we can restore it. And again, a common theme in these landscapes is we have a whole bunch of forest that's of medium age, and we have very little that's of the older forest age. And in some watersheds that haven't experienced fire yet, we have very little that's of the early age. We have a whole bunch in the medium age that's ready to burn. It's really prime stuff for a fire. So those are the kind of things that we can do something about if we do our treatments, and we reduce that amount of forest that's really highly flammable or highly susceptible to fire. So from that, we create these maps that the red areas are these are wildlife habitats that we'd like to create more of. We create a map that says these are the areas where the fire has departed from what it was historically, and we overlay those, and from that we get this map that says these red areas are the places where you can restore habitat and restore fire regimes on the same part of the landscape. And that is where we would focus on restoration type work. So we get a map that looks something like this. This is an integrated restoration priority. And it gives us a sense for, wow, we should really look down here, focus some time and energy on creating habitats and fire regimes that are going to be more resilient to when that fire comes stripping down through that landscape. And that's what this is about. How can we hang on to some of that habitat and create better landscapes to handle fire? So from the landscape, then, we then step down and say, all right, we found one of those little red spots. We want to do some restoration work there. We want to restore fire and habitat. So what are some of the key things that we need to consider in the design of our treatment? And Ken's going to get into this in even more detail, but the key things that we found in our research were marginal trees, right? And snags are an important component for many species of wildlife. And how those marginal trees and snags are arranged is really important as well. So what we're trying to create in these stands, so this is within a stand, this is within a patch of habitat. So we're trying to create places where we have a few scattered trees, we have small clumps of trees, and we have larger, and by larger I'm talking, a quarter of an acre or so of places where we have more dense. And this provides, within these stands, this provides the kinds of habitats that wildlife forage in, nest in, and maybe they roost in. So it gives us that way of addressing all the different life history patterns that birds show on these landscapes. Okay, that was a lot, but I'm going to leave you with this thought. This is from Charles Darwin. It's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the most responsive to change. And even back in 1858, he had this dialed in pretty well. But what I think I want to leave you with is you've seen the role at fire plays, you've seen opportunities for doing restoration, But we're going to see changes on these landscapes that we haven't seen before. And it's going to be interesting to see how those species react to those changes that we're hearing. With that, questions, comments, ideas? Yeah. Sure. So in that map that we had that I showed you that had areas highlighted in red, we would have a map that said this is prime martin habitat. This is where we would want to create more of it because we don't have enough of it. Martin are typically associated with older forests, and there's usually little of it in the landscape. So we would identify what parts of that landscape would be the best places to create that. Does that make sense? So we've used it as a species. Now let's sort out where we should create old forests.
But what are markings particularly used as forests?
Largely because they're fairly common and they are an old forest associated species. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
You know, historically, once we settled this area, a lot of these forests were used for timber extraction and wood products. And I noticed in your presentation you didn't address that future potential and how these strategies might incorporate availability of wood products.
Yeah, is the question, how would we incorporate the use of wood products in the restoration?
Right.
Yeah, good question. So there is a lot of wood out there that needs to be hauled away. There's no shortage of it. Those stands that have been fire suppressed, that have grown that second layer or third layer of forest, they're anywhere from pretty small to pretty good size now, the tree size. Some of them are merchantable even in today's market. Some of them are merchantable if we can get more uses out of small trees. And I think that's where the future, to me, that's where the interaction between using forest product, developing products and doing restoration at the same time. Is that the combination? Good question. Yeah.
So in the shrub steppe in our area, where we had a lot of bitter brush that burned hot, and we will have less bitter brush for a while, and more bunch grasses and probably cheatgrass. How would you expect wildlife to respond, and not just deer, but other wildlife to respond to that?
I think probably historically the way they respond, because that, the fire burning at a fairly high severity in the grassland shrubland was not unusual. It did, and it killed bitter brush, it killed sagebrush. It just depended on the time of year in which that happened. I've had some experience where we used different intensity of fire to try to rejuvenate winter regions, and I've been surprised at how much in certain conditions, bitter brush you can basically remove the entire upper what's above ground, and it'll resprout. It depends what happens to the moisture. This next summer is probably going to be pretty critical. So I think what will happen is some species will choose a different forage. So they'll forage on the grasses until the shrubs respond, or they're going to move somewhere where they still have that shrub component. But I don't want to think it's going to take forever for that shrub component. It may not. I think it's going to depend on a variety of situations where it might respond fairly quickly. As I was driving up, I worked there was a fire down here by the mine, the old mini mine, that burned in the mid-'80s, and I was looking up the hillside, and there are some it burned the bitter brush pretty well off, but there are places where some big bitter brush plants did respond. I don't think it's still even now as dense as it was before the fire, but it did come back. Yeah.
So I always like to know what we're, I guess, losing out on. You talked about how canopy dwelling species may lose out a lot in the fire. And to some degree, they would lose out with some of these treatments, and I'm curious what those species are, and what some of those species are.
That's the question again?
Well, the question is that if you're thinning forest, then you've got these some species that like dense forest that you have less of. So what do we have less of?
Okay, good. So what we have less, in most of those watersheds, the way we'd evaluate that is we'd look at that watershed, right? And we'd say how much of that closed canopy forest was there historically, and how much is there now. And we'd look and see whether it's above or below what it was. And then we'd look and see how much open canopy is there now, and how much was there historically. And it would be really looking, so it's sort of saying, well, let's match the white-headed woodpecker up with the pileated woodpecker or the martin, and see. So, and what you're trying to do is recreate that amount and mosaic of both of those habitats in the watershed, because there are places, even in the dry landscape, pretty dry landscapes, riparian areas and north slopes, that had more of that closed canopy, and that's where you'd want to create that stuff if it wasn't there. Conversely, if you're on an east slope or a south slope, and you've got a second growth of Douglas fir that's grown in over the top, underneath some pine, that's a great place to do the thing and create the open canopy. So really, what you want to do is use that reference condition to mimic that historic pattern and try to recreate that. The other thing that we try to do is use places where we do treatments to, what it does is it helps sort of break up that landscape so it's not a big contiguous amount of fuel. And you can kind of intersperse those areas where you create, say, white-headed woodpecker type conditions in and around the denser forest, thinking that as the fire moves through, instead of coming through the crowns, it might go to the ground, right? And it might move underneath that closed canopy instead of through it. And we've seen that in some cases. That's some of the other ideas that we could use. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Well, it seems like a lot of this activity has to be funded. You can't necessarily generate extracted wood products in the forest. Is that right?
Yeah, not all of it pays for itself out of the woods. You're absolutely right. You're going to have some investment. And quite honestly, if we're going to make a dent in it, we're going to have more of a public investment than we do now in being able to do some treatment. Some of the treatments with the small trees just don't pay for itself. Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
You had your reference conditions, but then we've also got climate change. So how do you reconcile that? You can't really go back to the reference.
Right.
You gotta kind of gain this future. How are you doing with that?
Yeah, good question. So we actually had, I didn't go into a lot of detail on this, but we actually have two sets of reference conditions. We have historic range of variability, and we have what we call the future range of variability. Okay. And so we actually compare where's the landscape now, where was it historically, and how much of that open close are we likely to have in the future. Now, not in all cases do we want to go to the future. We may be in some landscapes where, because of a listed species, we want to hang on to more of that closed canopy structure than maybe the future would support. And we want to do that in the short term. That's okay, but we know that consciously when we make that comparison. So what we're trying to do is anticipate how these landscapes might change in the future as a result of that. Good question.
How much do you take into account the notion of climate change, which is dealing with a historical pattern that was in a different climate? And so you can't really go back to the future in the same landscape.
So you can't go back to
The future.
yeah. So there are parts of the landscape where actually the historical range of variability and the future range of variability, we've looked at this, they're very similar. Okay? And the reason they are, think about those open pine forests. Think about the stability of those disturbance regimes. Those were pretty stable. Even in future climates, they're likely to be fairly stable. So we actually can look at some of the forests and say, well, HRV is actually not a bad measure. Now, when we get to the mid and the higher elevation forests, we got to look more carefully at the future. Yeah, so you got to look at both. It's a good question. Great question. Okay. All right, Kim, you're up. Thank you. Go. Well, thank you, Bill. That was
very, very informative and very thorough. My name is Ken Bevis. I'm a local wildlife guide, and I actually work for the Department of Natural Resources now in the Landowner Assistance Program with small landowners across the whole state, helping them with habitat questions on small woodlands. And so I've changed from being a Department of Fish and Wildlife permit guy to a salmon recovery guy, and now I'm down in the woods with people that have 5 to 100 acres, and I have a whole different spin on things that really is almost like, what could you do if you wanted to do something for wildlife in these environments? And so I really appreciate Bill's lead-in. And Bill, I gotta tell you something here. For those who ever worry about their pictures or something going out into the ether and having them come back around, that picture on your spotted owl slide in the corner of that ratty owl, I took that in 1986 on a slide, and I gave people copies of those slides and just let them go as, and I just love that, it reappears. So glad you could use it. What's that? Yeah. So, I'm just going to give you a few ideas here that will be informed by what Bill said, and I think it's actually a pretty good follow-up in regard to this. And so I've got some general thoughts, and the audience intended here is those people with land that they actually get to go out and do something. That you want to go do something on your land, because when you hear the scientific stuff and you see the graphs and you've got climate change and cohorts of this and that population and species, it is way, way interesting, admittedly. But when you're all done with that, you go home and you go, well, what the hell? What can I do about it? So here's my question. How many people in the room here, I hope somebody owns forest land or manages forest land? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, good. 6, 7, sweet. 8, 9. All right, excellent. So I do have some ideas. Hopefully you'll have a few ideas here that will be useful to you. So in a general sense, there are a lot of different kind of critters out there, and I appreciated what Bill said about the fire history going downhill and everything, but the variation between a hummingbird and a moose and a beaver is pretty extensive, and when you start considering the outcome of an action on the land, you really have to ask, what animal are you thinking of, or which cohort? And so I'm going to speak specifically to the forest, not so much the shrub steppe. And when you consider the forest as a habitat type, and Bill, I found this really interesting wherever he went. That one graph you had where you had the different fire severities and the number of species that's still bred there was that straight line all the way across. That in our state we have about 400 vertebrate species of wildlife. We've got, 6, 8, 10, however you lump them, different forest types, but there's a tremendous number of species that actually occur in all of those forest types. All of the general forest type that is a conifer-dominated, multi-layered thing, and different configurations of, open, closed, dense, different disturbance regimes, but the wildlife will respond indeed to the forest type. And so I'm going to say some general things about managing forests to provide for wildlife in a general sense, aiming at these smaller scale questions. So when you look at a forest, obviously they're dominated by trees. I say that for the Department of Fish and Wildlife people over there. Trees, Doug, trees, forest. Got it? And it's a complex habitat that's got a series of different sub-niches, meaning the snag, the down log, the shrub layer, the canopy itself. And of these, whenever we manipulate the forest, we're really working with one of those 4 components. And the one that in forestry activities we really don't pay much attention to is the understory, or the shrub layer. We just call it brush. People just kind of, brush. And it turns out that's one of the richest habitats that there is for providing for species. But in any case, it's a complex habitat full of these small niches. And whenever we do something, we manipulate those. You are here. I love this map because that 2/3 of the state covered with that dark green is essentially naturally conifer forest. And if you start going around to the various corners of the state,
just about all of the native species still occur, small, medium, and large. And there's a few places where they all still occur, including up here where we are in the North Cascades. I mean, you start going around. I love to do this when I talk to vendors. I'll say, what do you got? You got deer. Yeah, everybody's got deer. You got, bears. Yeah, cougars often. Wolves only up here. Will anybody ever mention it? And you keep going around, and the total cohort still occurs up here. I've just violated 2 of the tenets of speaking about wildlife biology in the state, by the way. You'd never say wolf or spotted owl. I've said both, which says something about the method. So anyway, so this corner of the state is pretty interesting, and I really appreciated Bill's diagram showing the forest type going downhill into those drier types and the disturbance regime. And I don't think I need to elaborate on that too much, because I'm having been in a couple of your classes. This is a remarkably well-informed group, and so I don't have to even go off on the notion of disturbance as an ecological concept, not an emotional concept in my case. About, so you look at the forest, and everybody thinks the forest is the same. It's sort of a fallacy of the human perspective in time and spaces. We don't really think of the forest as changing, but it is. It's in slow motion growth all the time, and it's remarkable relatively quickly, how fast it changes relative to us. Unfortunately, forests are slower than our lifespan, so pretty much anything that really happens that's meaningful is generally less than one lifespan. I mean, an 80-year-old tree is like that in this country. Is that fair, Doug, Jamie, something like that? Yeah. That's 80, and that's it. How long are we going to live? So point being, forests change, and then this thing about disturbance. When it's big, we can get it, but a lot of times it's subtle. And I'm throwing these different stand types here. There's a crown fire up by Tiffany Lake. Here's a stand over on Upper Bonaparte Creek that's burned historically. It's been logged 2 or 3 times. But the disturbance agents there are anthropogenic and also fire suppression. Or up on Sherman Pass, where they burned, they salvage logged it, and now look at that 2-legged stand. That fire was in 1990, so that's 24 years later, and I don't believe they replanted that. Maybe Bill would know. On Sherman's Pass, I don't think they planted it. They didn't have to. Right. So that's 24 years of change right there. And that's that same stand. Look at that understory, and look at all those snags. So the point of this is consider the habitat resulting from that disturbance and some of these elements that Bill was talking about. Like, I like that woodpecker cavity right there in the front, in the foreground on that picture right there, and all those snags back there. And there's places where you go out in the forest and the evidence of the disturbance is not obvious. So this is over by Ross Lake in the park. And you look at that happy little Doug fir forest there, and you might actually walk in there and think, wow, this is old growth. This stand has been here for a long time, which it probably has. But you look around, and here's a cedar snag down at the bottom, and on the side of it, there was a burn scar. So that stand had burned, and there was a cohort of survivor trees, and then the rest of them had come in after that fire, probably, 150 years ago, 200 maybe, something like that. So evidence of disturbance even in these stands. A large snag like this one over by Bonaparte Lake that had at least 14 cavities in it. It was one of the most spectacular snags I've ever seen. The guy that owns this property has known that tree for 35 years, and it hasn't changed in 35 years. So that's a very stable habitat element. So I'm showing these examples of disturbance outcomes. Oh, and of course, the obvious pileated on the snag. Oh, the big burn scar on that big Doug fir there on the right. That was part of that same Doug fir stand. But that tree is probably, 300, 400 years old, and the rest of the stand is 150. So we have evidence of these disturbances. And of course, in our dry types, the old burn scar on the ponderosa pine, we've tested back to the number of years between the fires and everything like that. And so our pine stands really, really show us the evidence of these disturbances that have shaped the habitat we see today. There's one of the big pileated cavity. This is down by Lake Wenatchee, and that snag has probably been standing for, I would bet 100 years at least. That was there when they logged it the first time, and for whatever reason they went